Hey everyone, real quick before we get into today's video, I wanted to talk about Chilling, the awesome horror app I'm partnered with. In case you haven't heard, every week I have new stories that release over on Chilling. There are now over 1,000 stories on Chilling, with a bunch of other YouTube narrators and professionals to choose from. On Chilling, you can do things that you've never been able to do on YouTube. You can choose from over 1,000 individual stories that are sorted into curated playlists, or you can create your own. On Chilling, we give you so much flexibility to listen the way you want. This includes a chilling, game-changing feature, our ambient menu. You can change the background sounds of the story at any time to fit your mood. Go from rain to a campfire with the press of a button. It's totally revolutionary and you need to try it. There have been a number of awesome updates to Chilling, such as the ability to download stories for offline listening and the new social feature, as you can now discuss your favorite stories with other users and friends. And we're just getting started. Not only are we adding hours of new content every week, but original video content is also in the works. Chilling is evolving into a must-have for all horror lovers. So feel free to head over and start your free trial over on Chilling and check out my personal playlist there. And don't forget, this month Chilling is also giving away another PS5 bundle. Just leave a review on Google Play or the App Store letting us know what you think. Click the link in the description for more details on how to enter. I mentioned in the comments section of a video of yours that I had a story you might be interested in. Well, here it is. It isn't a long one, but it's a good one. Well, if you count Absolutely Terrifying as being a good story, which, considering your channel, I suppose you will. I once went on a date with a guy who seemed really confident about himself. I'll admit I found that very attractive at first, and although he kept himself relatively polite at first, he just had this really confident, dominant way about him that I just found so alluring. And after a while, that confidence turned a little more aggressive, and he started to cross the line to the point where I had to say, "Dude, chill. You're ruining the mood with that." He apologized, which I accepted, and then we went on talking about this and that in a much more comfortable mood. But after a while, that confidence turned into a little more aggressive. Right as we were about to go our separate ways, we're talking about having a second date, and he says something about me not forgetting about him. I jokingly said, "Oh, I won't forget about you," which was kind of a backhanded compliment referring to how aggressive he'd been with me, and I didn't mean it in a really mean way. And that's when he says something like, to make sure you never forget about me, I think I'd cut my initials into your thigh with a really sharp knife. That way, you'd remember me anytime you took your pants off." I was just stunned. I really didn't know what to say to that. I let out this nervous laughter that I think he mistook for actually enjoying what he said. I told him I'd contact him about a second date, then went home and blocked all of his contact details to make sure that he couldn't message me again. I keep thinking that one day, I'll see his name and picture in some online news article saying how he killed some girl that he was dating. That's how it happened with that dating game killer, right? He dated some of the girls he ended up murdering and said some pretty messed up stuff to them during their dates. Giant red flags they didn't pay attention to until it was way too late. I feel like it's just a matter of time until he does something like that, and I wish there was a way of me reporting him to the dating app I met him on so they could ban his profile or whatever. I'm scared that he'll do something, and I'll only have myself to blame because I didn't do something about it when I had the chance. But what do I tell the police? That we had a bad date and he said some weird stuff? That's not a crime as far as I know. But then, how long before he can't contain himself and does some kind of irreversible damage to a girl? How long until I see that picture of him on a news website as being the Tinder killer or whatever? I feel like it really is just a matter of time, and then I'll have to live with the guilt for the rest of my life. For most of my young life, I grew up in a very safe area. It was one of those neighborhoods where all the kids knew each other and often stayed out well after dark in the summers to play flashlight tag or manhunt. Our biggest concern was calling our parents to let them know that we would be sleeping over at a friend's house. I mention all of this so you can understand how terrifying my mother's story was to a fairly sheltered 16-year-old me. My mother was and remains to this day one of the strongest women I had ever known. She survived decades of mental, emotional, and I suspect in her early years physical abuse from her sociopathic father. When he tried to prevent her from getting away by refusing to help cover college expenses, she moved out anyway and paid every cent on her own. When a drunk redneck tried to assault a friend of hers, she gave him a hard right hook and dropped that pile of human garbage. And if people ever threatened her kids' safety, God help them, that woman makes Mama Grizzlies look friendly. So, as you might imagine, I never thought anything could scare this woman. But now I understand that even the bravest person can fear for their very survival when monsters come out of the shadows. This takes place around the year 1985 in my home state of South Carolina. My parents had only been married for about 2 years at the time, both very excited and determined to make something of themselves. They didn't have a lot of money back then, and were renting a tiny apartment until they could save enough to buy a house. Mom hated that apartment, specifically the large window in their bedroom that people from the street could easily see into. They wanted to put up curtains, but there were no rods, and the landlord was a cheapskate who threatened to keep their deposit if they put even a dent into the wall. It annoyed them that they could have no privacy in their own home, but they decided since it was a short-term lease to just ignore it. It was a big mistake. This open window would cause Mom to have nightmares for years after. And now let me tell you about how a murderer first targeted my mom as a potential victim. Mom was an avid runner and a competitive cross-country athlete all through high school. She would often go for 3 or 4 mile long runs in the evenings to clear her mind after work. The area she was running in is a bit rural, with few houses and little traffic on the roads. It's an area that high schools like to use in the fall for track and country training. On the day she was out there, it was early summer, so no students or other runners were about. She liked the quiet and kind of mentally drifted for a bit. As an old brown-colored car with tinted windows came up behind her, she moved off the road to let them pass. The car seemed to be going past her. The windows were even with her, and then it slowed down. The car stayed like this for around 10 minutes, never speeding or slowing, only a few feet behind her. Mom realized that this person had bad intentions and knew her life was in danger. Worried there was no one around who could help, she had to make a quick decision. So she sprinted off in the field next to her, thankfully finding a small ditch lined with several thick bushes. She crawled into the largest one and laid flat on her stomach to hide. The car had tried to follow, but the curb had hindered the back wheels. The person tried gunning it, but the car would not go forward. They were able to reverse and get back onto the road. They drove up the road and back several times, most likely trying to see if they could spot Mom. After 5 or 6 passes, they gave up and drove off. Mom was so scared she barely remembered to breathe, shaking and crying, waiting for this clearly malicious person to get out of the car. Thankfully, they never did. After waiting 30 minutes and no sign of the car, she ran back to her apartment. My dad was home at the time and shocked to see the state that she was in. She told him what had happened and wondered if they should call the cops. Dad promised her that he would take care of it and told her to take a long, warm shower so she could relax. After all, this was home and he would never let anyone hurt her. Mom took that shower and was just starting to feel better when she looks out their bedroom window. I think you can guess what she saw parked just outside. It was the exact same car. Utterly terrified, she screamed and Dad came running. She pointed out towards the car and he lost it. He bolted out of the apartment and ran towards the car, shouting that he was going to kill them if they even thought about touching his wife. Now, just to let you know, my dad was about 5'10" and thin as a rail. Friendly and always ready to give a helping hand, he was not an intimidating figure to most people. But on that day, my dad showed that animal that he would do whatever it took to protect his family. The car immediately backed up, tires squealing as the man booked it. My parents later called the cops and told them everything. Unfortunately, there was not much they could do, as there had been no physical attack. All they could do was take a note and advise my mother to not run alone for a while. Yeah, as if she was the problem. They begrudgingly accepted this and moved to a new place shortly after, and no deposit was worth their lives. A few months passed and reports of multiple young women going missing, followed by 2 murders, brought closure to this story. Mom recognized the car the murderer was driving. It was the same one that had stalked her. What really made her blood run cold was the picture of his victims. All young, blonde, blue-eyed women who could have been sisters, who could have been her sisters. I've googled the victims and it's shocking how much they look like her, down to the way they styled their hair. And according to the FBI profiler who went on to write the book that inspired Mind Hunters, this man was one of the most vicious and sadistic killers he ever dealt with, maybe the most evil killer in his career. After reading about the way that he would torture the families and made those poor girls write a last will before murdering them, I'm inclined to agree. So, Larry Jean Bell, I'm glad you're gone. I'm glad my parents found strength in each other to make you run off like a dog with its tail tucked between its legs. The world is a better place without a monster like you in it. I hope those poor girls and their families found peace, knowing you couldn't hurt anyone again. I was on a plane once and noticed that although people were still boarding, there was a large number of seats around me unoccupied. The last people on, though, were all together and consisted of one large family traveling together. There were 4 adults and about 10 children, ranging from toddler age to high school young adult. They had the usual look of a large group traveling with children, some of whom were shy and withdrawn, others who were running around, and the adults looking frazzled, trying to keep everyone and everything together. When they'd all been seated, there seemed to be some issue with the seating, as one member of their party was supposed to sit several rows back. The flight attendant apologized and said that it happens, that sometimes their computer will shuffle sequential seating, etc., but assured them that there was seating available for everyone. The family sat down, -1, and starting with the usual, "That's a shame, wish they could sit up here" talk. Since it seemed that their party were surrounding me, I stopped the flight attendant and asked if I could switch seats with another passenger. This caught the attention of the large group, perhaps anticipating a complaint, but the flight attendant told me no, they don't usually do that, and that everyone's been seated, but asked if there was a problem with where I was sitting. I explained to her that I had been traveling solo and didn't care where I sat, and asked if I could give my seat to the member of the family who was absent, as my seat would have put them in the midst of their group. The family overheard and was thanking me, as I retrieved my bag overhead and followed the flight attendant to the family member's seat. She explained what was happening, and I noticed that the family member, a young girl, maybe 12 years old, seemed in a hurry to get back to her family and thanked me, probably about 3 or 4 times. She practically ran up the aisle, and before I could sit down, the man who'd been sitting next to her was literally staring with his mouth open and asked, "What's the problem?" No, that girl was sitting here first. That was a weird red flag to me. But the flight attendant explained to him what was happening, and he immediately looked at me and said, "No, I don't want to sit next to him. Where's the girl going?" She explained to him that there was no issue and nothing that she could do now. I think she was getting the same sort of creepy vibe. Now, I want to assure everyone that I'm not in the habit of judging people by their appearance, but this guy was the definition of red flags. He was overweight and paunchy, half-bald, with few strands combed over, thick glasses and just no chin. He was a mouth breather, and he kept his mouth open constantly, almost drooling on himself and sucking it back in between heavy breath. If there were a textbook example of a creep, it would be him. As I was putting my bag overhead, he started talking to himself, under his breath, about how this was BS and just my luck, wasn't bothering anybody, and why did they move that girl? I wanted to say something to him but didn't. And it wasn't long before my neighbor got a call and was talking about an upcoming court appearance, and I overheard, quote-unquote, no victim's testimony, and rarely show up, and, quote, people wouldn't ask me to babysit if I was like that. The only time I said almost anything to him was when he started blatantly watching adult films, explicit ones, on his laptop with earphones in, grunting, sweating, wheezing, and kept repeating just terrible language when a part was on that he evidently liked. Then, took a blanket and covered his lap, his hands fidgeting underneath it. As soon as I saw that he intended on keeping them there, I pretended to reach for the call button, and then he jerked his hands out and started muttering under his breath about me minding my own business. At some point, I got up to see the restroom, and when I returned, he was on the phone again, and I caught something about, "Oh, look at her, the butt on her. No, switch seats on me. Got away." And he shut up as he saw me approaching. The creep went to sleep eventually and fortunately stayed asleep the rest of the flight. When we were all deboarding, a woman I presumed was the mother was standing with the girl and said, "Thank you again." I shuddered to think how he acted in the short time that she was next to him, or how he would have had she remained there. Shocking absolutely no one, including himself, he was met at the gate by security and police, and as he was being led away, he said, "This isn't my laptop, by the way." This happened during the summer of 2002 when I was on a family trip in Las Vegas. My family and I was 11 at the time, went on a vacation to Las Vegas. There were a bunch of us since we had family visiting from out of the country. After hitting the swimming pool, my family wanted to go to another hotel to go shopping. My grandma, note she had just immigrated from the Philippines a few years before and knew very limited English, and I decided to go back up to our hotel room because she was tired and I wanted to change before meeting back up with the rest of our family later on for lunch. We got into the elevator, and as it was closing, an older gentleman, maybe in his early to mid-50s, asked to hold the door. I remember my mom telling me not to let any strangers know where our room was, so before we got in, I pressed 2 more floors, and thank God I did. He got in and started making small talk. He looked at my shirt. I was wearing a Beach Babe Contest tank top from Limited Too and said, "Where's the Beach Babe Contest? I'd like to be the judge and make sure you win." My grandma and I smiled at each other and laughed. Then he asked what room we were staying in. I told him that we were visiting a family member's room. He then asked if we were staying at the hotel and if he could escort us back to our room. I told him no. His face at some point turned cold, whereas before he appeared friendly. He began to insist that he walk us back to our room. At that point, I began panicking and just fell silent. My grandma stared at me. And after what felt like an eternity, his smile came back and then said, "Come on, I'm just being nice, right, Grandma?" I remember my stomach sinking, until finally the elevator opened and a couple walked in. I don't know what in me told me to just trust them, but I blurted out, "I don't know this man, but he's forcing me to let him walk me to my hotel room, and I'm kind of scared." The man then laughed and told them that I was his niece. I kept my composure as best I could, but I just remember starting to cry, and I couldn't stop crying. My grandma was confused because she didn't really know what was going on, having not spoken the language. The couple told us to get off the elevator so that I could call my parents, and they walked me and my grandma down to the hotel lobby to the reception desk. I still get chills thinking about what may have happened that day. I, a 28-year-old female, was in my first year as a physical therapist at a large hospital chain. Though I was inside the hospital, I worked in a small outpatient clinic where patients came to me for appointments and left. As the newest therapist, I was given the late shift from 9 to 7:30 that catered to those who needed therapy and also had to work during the day. We were usually pretty slow in the evenings since most of our patients were retired seniors, so I was alone after 5. Like any normal day, I had a new evaluation come in for shoulder pain. Pretty run-of-the-mill stuff. He was a middle-aged man, good-looking, well-educated, and very polite. I did the evaluation and decided to see him twice a week for 6 weeks. I tried to assign him to my assistant, but he refused to be treated by him, stating that he would only work with me. That was fine. He wanted later treatment times anyways, and my assistant went home before I did. Our first few weeks of treatments go by. He was so kind and charismatic. I started to look forward to treating him as we shared a lot of the same interests. He even started waiting for me to lock up and walking out to my car in the parking garage with me. I hated the parking garage, especially when it was dark, so I welcomed him walking me to my car. At some point in our treatments, though, I noticed a shift in him. Our light small talk started to turn more flirty. From him, anyways. I was happily married and not flirting back, but as any woman knows, some men can confuse our niceness with flirtation. He started making advances and asking me out to drinks after therapy. I politely declined and tried to circle back to talking about his therapy. He seemed agitated and started to become less and less compliant with exercises. He stopped talking as much as well, and I could tell the mood had shifted. This day I decided that it would be best not to walk with him to my car. I didn't tell him this at first, so he went out of the clinic and waited by the elevator for me to lock up. I wasn't sure what to do and couldn't call my partner as they were out of town on business. So I opened the door from the clinic to the hall where he was and told him I had paperwork to catch up on and would see him at his next appointment. He looked at me with such anger in his eyes and started walking faster and faster back to the door I was at. Luckily, I was able to close the door and flip the lock before he made it to the door. He pushed the handle trying to get back in and, realizing it was locked, stepped back. Of course, this door is essentially a giant window and he could see me on the other side, freaking out but trying the best to conceal it. He told me to let him inside, and he could wait with me while I finished my notes. I said thank you, but I had a lot to do. He insisted, and I declined again. He pushed once again on the door, and when it didn't open quickly, turned around angrily and went back to the elevator. I was shaking and terrified that he would come back, so I went to the private offices and locked that door as well. I grabbed a large dowel rod that wouldn't do much to him but made me feel a little better to have. At this point, I knew that I couldn't leave as he knows where I park and what car I drive and could be waiting for me. I called security for the hospital and luckily one of the guards was doing his rounds close by and said that he would walk me to my car. We head out to my car and I see my patient parked a few spots down from me inside of his car. When he sees me and the guard walking towards my car, he backs up and pulls away. I thank the guard and get in my car. I drive a few loops before going home to make sure that I wasn't being followed. Luckily, I wasn't. The next day I go to my boss and tell her what happened. She accuses me of being paranoid and says I need to continue to treat him. I asked her about having another therapist stay late with me and she says that she would ask a few people but not to get my hopes up as nobody likes working the late shift. I work my normal day, dreading the next day, knowing that is when I am scheduled to see him again. That evening, I call my brother and ask him to come to the clinic when this patient was supposed to be here and wait in the waiting room, and thankfully he agrees. The next day, it is time for this patient to come in and no one is there. This patient was always early to his appointment, so I was very surprised. 15 minutes turns to 30 and he's still not there. I decided I waited long enough and I locked up and myself and my brother left. The weekend comes and goes by. Monday I'm back at work. I had no messages from this patient about the no-show and had no plans to reach out to him despite that being protocol. Lunchtime rolls around and I decide to go to the hospital cafeteria to eat. There are TVs scattered all around and I sit in front of one playing the local news. I occasionally look up at it from my phone and one of the times I do, I see a familiar face. My patient. He was in handcuffs being walked out of his house. The sound wasn't on, but I read his name being arrested under suspicion of multiple murders. My jaw dropped to the floor. Now the TV had my full attention as 3 pictures of young, white, blonde women popped up on the screen as his apparent victims. Young, blonde, white women looking very similar to myself. It took me a while to fully grasp what I had just seen. I went to my manager and told her what I had saw. Apparently not believing me, she searched his name on Google, and sure enough, there were multiple articles and news clips talking about his arrest. She apologized to me for not listening when I expressed my concerns and told me I could leave early if I needed. I stayed the rest of my shift but told her I wouldn't work late anymore by myself. By next shift, I had one of the therapy aides assigned to stay with me until we closed. I ended up transferring to a different part of the hospital that had better hours after a few months, but I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I had gone to get drinks with him, or if I continued walking to my car with him. I mean, I was only going to see him for a couple of more weeks, so what was his plan? Was I his next target? He is still awaiting trial last I checked, and hopefully will be convicted so he'll be locked far away from anyone else. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. I'm still haunted by my old memories of an ex-boyfriend I dated for only a few months. We met online and lived an hour apart, but we clicked very fast and started seeing each other regularly. Things were going great for about a month, and one day we stopped at my place so I could pack some clothes to go stay at his place for the weekend. We walked into my bedroom, and as I started packing my belongings, I noticed him scanning around my room with his eyes. After a few awkward moments of silence, he began to ask me some very specific and eerily detailed questions. Do you ever move your pillow to the foot of your bed at night and pull your blinds all the way up so you can see the stars out of this window over here before you go to sleep? I bet you use this lamp over here the most. It's the only one that I'd use. I was frozen in shock. I just stood there speechless, looking at him in disbelief. He just described everything I did the night before, and it was the only time I ever rolled up my blinds at night and laid at the opposite end of my bed to look up at the stars in the sky. I told nobody about that, so how the hell did he know? The only thing I could do next was to laugh it off and ask him how he knew, but he just kind of shrugged it off and changed the subject. I couldn't stop thinking about it the whole weekend, though, wondering if he had been watching me. I hid my paranoia as best I could until I got home, but I then did a deep sweep of my entire bedroom looking for any sign of hidden cameras. I found nothing. I didn't have any laptops, computers, TV, or security cameras in my bedroom that he could have hacked to spy on me with. I did have my mobile phone in the room, but it was laying flat on my nightstand that night. If he was physically stalking me, it would have been difficult for him to see into my bedroom as my room was pretty high up. He would have had to watch further away from the forest, and even if that was the case, there were some large trees in my backyard that would have blocked his view. It just didn't make any sense, and it still doesn't make sense to me. I tried to pass this off as coincidence, but when I stepped back and looked at the whole picture, there was something not right about him. I vividly recall the first time I ever spoke to him on the phone before we met, and we had so much in common, almost too much in common. From books we were reading to very specific interests, hobbies, and habits, I thought I met my soulmate. Nobody has ever made me feel so alive. He swept me off my feet, only to drop me from what I thought was heaven. He became a different person seemingly overnight. He was a narcissist, and I watched his mask fall off. We had texted on and off for a few years after, but I've since gone to no contact. I will probably never know the hows and whys, but I continue to wonder and look over my shoulder. A few years back, I had this really creepy experience with an older coworker of mine that still kind of shakes me to this day. It happened at this place that I'd been working at for a couple of years at that point. The place was a small factory of sorts with only less than a handful of employees, including myself. One day, though, my boss introduced us to this new older guy that he brought in to start working in the other newer side of the factory. You see, the factory where he worked had two different sides to it, one side for beeswax and one side for wood production. My boss had brought him in because they went to church together and the wood production on the other side had a religious significance. The new older coworker worked there with us for about 1 month before he approached me one day and introduced himself to me. He seemed like a nice guy and even came back to give me a Hershey kiss not long after that, the chocolate. A couple of months later, I got asked by our boss if I could go pick up my new older coworker, probably because his car was broken down or something. I agreed to it, so my boss asked me if it was okay to give the coworker my phone number so that we could coordinate via text. I said it was fine and went on my way. I brought him back to the factory with no problems. Soon after that, though, I started to get random and sporadic texts from him late at night. At first, the texts were just about maybe hanging out soon, while simultaneously apologizing to me because he knew that he was much older than I. But then the texts started to get pretty pervy, and they would be as long as a mini book, I swear to God. The texts were just long, misspelled, random, pervy compilations. I tried to just ignore the texts, but that only made them start coming more frequently. In the midst of all this one day, my roommates were scrounging for a ride to a casino only a few miles from our house. I gave them a few dollars for a ride, and they said that they'd find their own ride back. So imagine my surprise when they returned only a couple of hours later with their own ride all right. Their ride was my creepy coworker. Not only was I creeped the hell out that this pervy jerk now knew where I lived, but I also didn't know how he came to give my roommates that ride. Was it just sheer coincidence or something more? A few days after that, I went to find a friend in his apartment that was located on our main street, running through our small historic downtown area. When I came downstairs from his apartment, as he was located on the second floor, I made my usual turn, walking on the sidewalk in front of all the main street shops. As I walked past one of the shops that was maybe 2 doors down from my friend's apartment, I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, but it couldn't be it. To my great dismay, it was him, my creepy older coworker, standing in the doorway of one of the shops and smiling creepily at me from under a black top hat. A couple of weeks after that little incident, I noticed him again as I left my friend's apartment. He was just standing on the sidewalk with that same creepy grin plastered on his gaunt face. Since I had already informed my friend after the last incident, I simply texted him real quick to let him know the creep was back. I got into my car and left after sending the text, so I didn't find out until later that the creepy coworker was gone by the time my friend got downstairs to the sidewalk. At that point, though, the texts were still coming even faster than before. He was even threatening to come by my house if I didn't respond. Long, provocative texts dictating what he'd like to have happen between us if he did just happen to show up at my house. When I would see him during the day at work, though, he would act as though everything were normal, giving no hint of his nighttime persona. After seeing him yet again as I left my friend's apartment, I just so happened to overhear a couple of coworkers of mine standing around discussing how weird our new, older coworker was. Right then, I stepped in and joined the conversation, finally showing one of my other coworkers the text messages that the creep had been sending me. I had been working with that particular coworker for a few years, but I didn't know him too well. He was one of those people who came off kind of grumpy and distant. Still, I told him and my other coworker not to say anything. They both nodded in agreement and went our separate ways to finish up for the day. When I came into work the next day, my boss immediately called me into his office. My boss told me that he had been informed of the situation in the text and he wanted to see my phone to read them. I told my boss that I didn't really want to get anyone in trouble, but he said that was besides the point and that my situation needed to be addressed. My boss also stated that my older coworker had no right to reason to be texting me and talking to me that way the way he was talking to me. The boss must have had a pretty good talk with him because all the crap stopped from the older coworker after that. The other grumpy coworker of mine apologized to me for saying something to the boss, but I completely understood and I was actually pretty grateful to him for that. I should have been the one to take the initiative to talk to the boss about it, but I guess I was just too chicken. Fortunately, though, that situation seemed to work out for all involved because life went on as usual and everyone involved acted as though nothing had ever happened. Well, I can't really say that because that situation actually caused the grumpy coworker and I to talk more and we started dating. We were together for about 3 years and then we got married. When my boyfriend and I, a 24-year-old female, lived with his grandparents a few months ago, my boyfriend worked early morning hours. He would leave the house at around 4 a.m., and one winter morning, while it was still pitch black out, my boyfriend kissed me goodbye and I went back to bed. A few minutes later, I heard continuous knocking at the front door. Immediately, I assumed it was him forgetting something and being half asleep. I ran up the stairs from my room to open the door, but as soon as I reached for it, his grandma called out to me from upstairs and said, "Don't open the door. That's not him." I froze and was too afraid to even peek through the front door window to see who it actually was. His grandma looked outside and said it was a man that had no jacket on. He then left our doorway and went on his way through the streets. My grandma told me she knew immediately that it wasn't my boyfriend because if it actually were him, he would have opened the door with his house key. He would not wake us this early in the morning. Not long after, a cop car cruised down our street with a light on, as if though it were searching for someone. I was so terrified that I decided to sleep upstairs in the living room. Later on in the day, our grandma spoke to our neighbors and found out that he was also pounding on everyone's door in the same block. One of the neighbors a couple of houses down is a huskier, taller guy, and he said that he talked to the stranger through the door, asking what he wants. The man said someone's looking for him, they want to shoot him and that he needs to hide from them. I am more on the petite side, and at the time I was about 19. I can't imagine what could have happened had I opened the door for him, or if my boyfriend's grandma wasn't there. I was around 12 years old when this happened. I lived in a duplex that my parents owned, and one day I was outside in the front yard playing with my dogs. The house was located in a neighborhood that's right by a busy main road, so during the daily rush hour, the area got pretty busy. Thank God for this, because as I was busy with my dogs, I noticed a black car in front of my house that kept inching forward a little and backing up a little. I noticed the driver leering at me in a creepy way and got a really bad feeling, so I ran up the stairs to where I lived with my parents. I told my mom about what had happened, and I have no idea what was going through her mind at the time because she didn't seem all that concerned. A few minutes later, she went to the grocery store that was a block away, and after griping about that to her, I went walking to the store. The duplex is across the street from a bank, and next to the bank, on the other side of the wall by the drive-up tellers, was an alley that also led to the store. I decided to take the bank route because I felt safer. As I was walking by the ATM, thankfully there was a line of people waiting to use it. Who do I see but the same creepy guy in his car parked at the bank in front of the ATM? I kept my eyes on him as I walked past his car, and he was leaning forward with his hands on the wheel, ogling me and licking his lips. I got the F out of there as quickly as I could and ran the rest of the way to the store. As I was walking out of the exit while leaving the store, I saw my brother waiting for me outside. He told me to get in and drove me home. He had been listening to what I told our mom about the guy outside the house and reamed her out for making me walk to the store alone, knowing that this guy was lurking around the neighborhood. To this day, I still get chills knowing how close I came to potentially being kidnapped by that weird pervert who licked his lips, and it makes me sick to even think about it, to be honest. So I've been waiting to get this off my chest for a while now, and the reason I'm writing this post tonight is due to an incident at my previous school a week or two ago. However, this incident goes back a ways with a girl in my class I knew, and honestly forgot about until I heard about this. So last year or so, my family and I moved to a new town a little ways away from our old one. I attended my old school for many years and really loved it. The story starts at this school in the summer before 7th grade with me and my friend. It's also important to note that I lived right in front of my friend's house and next to this girl, and this will be relevant later. We were taking summer school classes and were specifically in a science one, which is where I met this girl. I'm going to call her Jen. I realized that she was sitting in a corner by herself and never spoke at all during class. Now, I am very introverted and struggle with social anxiety, so I never wrote her off for being that way. In fact, I tried to be nice to her because I've been there and done that. Fast forward to fall when school started. In the first semester, I had study hall and choir with her. She was still pretty quiet and never really talked much. But one time a popular kid in my class decided to talk with her and mentioned her sister. She started to go on and on about how she hated her in great detail, and she called her things like fat, stupid, and ugly and stuff like that. I thought it was pretty mean, but I am a sibling myself, so I really didn't think much of it until the bell rang. As everyone was walking out, I could hear her muttering to herself, "Kill Leah, kill Leah, kill Leah," with a blank expression, Leah being her sister. I guess I must have made a freaked out expression because she quickly went up to me and said, "Oh, I wasn't serious, I'm just kidding." To which I just said, "All right," and went to choir. In the next semester, I had health class with her and coincidentally sat right behind her in the back. One day, we had a free day and were able to just play games and stuff on our laptops. I was pretty engrossed playing Run, but was a little freaked out when I looked up. Jen was on a website with what looked to be stuff involving witchcraft or something of the sort. The whole page was black and white text with odd images attached. She never realized I saw this, but I still thought it was pretty weird, so I ended up telling the teacher that I was concerned for her based on all of the recent events. I don't know if he ever did anything, but I do know that she was called into the counselor's office a few times, which made me relieved because she was getting help. On the last day of school, though, she had a personal laptop with her, and she really abruptly went up to me and asked if I wanted to look for ghosts in the school, to which I said no. My friend group recognized this, and they mentioned they also noticed she did some weird things, which definitely should have been a red flag. In the summer before 8th grade, Jen and her family had a for sale sign on their house. I thought those encounters would be the last, but I was wrong. One time I walked next to my friend's house and she was painting my nails on the bench outside. We saw Jen's dogs running around, but more importantly, we could hear screaming from inside the house, which honestly just sounded manic. By the tone, I could tell that it was her screaming at one of her parents. We both became wide-eyed and didn't know what to do, so I just went home and sat on my porch. Again, I heard her yelling and doors slamming, and that was my final encounter until now. About a year ago, Jen friended me on Facebook and I accepted it. We never really interacted, but about a month ago I saw a string of screenshots that she posted, claiming that my old school did nothing but harassment and bullying. I think I just added a sad emoji and went about my day, and not really thinking anything of it. In the screenshots was a conversation between her and a boy through email chat. They said there was something wrong with her and that she needed help due to her profile pictures. She was strangely defensive, and I honestly thought maybe she just had an edgy anime profile picture or something. Anyway, a week ago my dad showed me a news article about a school shooting threat at my old school. I was pretty upset when I heard this, but became more concerned when he told me the details. He told me that the student had pictures of dead and mutilated bodies as their profile picture. I remember my heart just sunk when I connected the dots. She apparently had also threatened to shoot up the school on her Snapchat story after being suspended for the profile pictures. Out of curiosity, I recently logged into my old school's Gmail and searched her email address. I was able to see that her picture was of a man in a tank top who appeared to be drowning in water, and I was horrified by this. I searched for her Gmail after she had already been suspended, so I couldn't really tell what was in the picture or maybe if it was a reference to some art thing. Anyways, I haven't really heard much more than what I have wrote other than she is currently in police custody, but I just want to say that I really hope that Jen gets the help that she needs. I don't know what she had been through or what her home life is like or was like, but I do genuinely think she was struggling mentally, I have since unfriended Jen, and I hope to never have to hear from her or about her ever again. I'm an older woman. I'm married and have one daughter who is 11. This happened to both of us at separate times within a 2-week span. First, my story. My husband and I don't share a room because he snores like a chainsaw, and I apparently move way too much in my sleep. My daughter is autistic and suffers from serious anxiety and more often than not ends up crawling into bed with me. Yes, this is significant to the story. Well, one night she wasn't able to even make it to her room and crashed with me. I woke up after midnight to a knocking on my window. My room is at the back of the house and my backyard is fenced and the gate is blocked because of my 2 pooches. I thought at the time I was dreaming, but then there was another knock on the window and I heard my daughter's voice outside my window. "Mommy, can you please open the door? I'm locked out." My sliding door doesn't lock. We block it using a metal safety rod. My daughter was sound asleep right beside me, so whoever was outside was not my daughter. And I just chalked it up to a lucid dream and went back to sleep. A week later, I came home from my late shift. My daughter was sleeping in her own bed, thankfully. I settle in and fall asleep. A few hours later, my daughter comes into my room and crawls into bed with me, and I wake up and she says, "Mommy, why were you knocking on my window and wanting me to come outside?" I was wide awake immediately and sat up. "What do you mean, hon? I've been sleeping for a while. I heard you say, when you knocked on my window, 'Hey, Rabbit.'" Shortened from Bunny Rabbit, the nickname she's had since birth. "Want to come out and play? So I came in here to see if you were outside." I didn't tell her that I had heard a similar thing a week prior. Like I said, not really scary, but extremely weird, especially since I'm the only one that calls her Rabbit. So it was suggested that I add to my post that I do live in a town with a very large psychiatric facility, as well as a maximum security prison. We don't have a bus station, so people who are released with no family join our very large homeless population. This could have been the situation. It just seemed too coincidental to be that way. This is my ex-girlfriend's experience while we were together, and I mainly want to tell it so people, mainly women, can be cautious. My ex and I moved to a new area closer to our workplaces, which happened to be in a very bad neighborhood. We were young and just really needed a cheap apartment. We did not know how truly dangerous the neighborhood was. She had an early morning meeting for work and needed to fill her car up with gas. When we first moved to the neighborhood, I noticed a few blocks away there was a gas station that looked extremely sketchy. I even made a point to say that we probably should get gas somewhere else, even though it's the closest to our apartment. When she pulled in, she was the only car there and she begins pumping her gas. While she's filling up, she sees 2 men walk out of the gas station mini-mart, and when they see her, they both immediately turn around and go back in the mart. She thought that was strange and continued pumping. A few moments go by and the men come back out and walk straight to her. They start chatting with her, asking where she's going and if she wants to go to a party. She reminds them it's 6 a.m. and they just laugh and continue to try and persuade her. The position they decided to stand really made her uncomfortable. They positioned themselves in a way where they had either side of her and she felt like she wouldn't be able to jump in her car if she needed to get away quickly. All of a sudden, another car pulls in to get gas and the 2 men just suddenly sprint away, as if though they had already committed a crime. I still wonder what would have happened if that car never pulled in. So, when I was in high school, I worked at a Walmart. There were a few in the town that I grew up in, but this one was by far the biggest. It was also generally the easiest to get to because several huge roads ran right by it. Because of that, working as a cashier, you saw all sorts of people at all stages in their lives. Most people are nice enough, but every now and then you'd get somebody that just made you wonder about them. I was working later than I normally did one night because the Weather Channel was calling for snow late that night and school had been canceled. Great, I don't mind. I could use the hours. It was slow though because the normal pre-snowstorm rush had already been through and now people were just holed up at some home waiting for the storm. I was on one of the express lane registers and finally had a customer come up. He only had a few things, but the first red flag was the way he put them on the counter. Normally when you only have a few things, you just set them up all at once, right? He held them out to me individually and would make sure that his fingers touched mine when I took them from him. After I rang his few things and bagged them, I told him the total, and he handed me the payment all in ones and change, which meant I had to count it, so it takes a minute or two longer than a credit card transaction might have. In that time, he's trying to make conversation about how he was just at the club. With all the ones he'd had and the amount of meth it looked like he consumed on a daily basis, I can imagine what club it was. And all the girls had turned him down, so now he was just going to have to go home all alone and eat a sandwich on his own. I made some sort of sympathetic noise, finished counting, and tried to give him his change and receipt. He made no move to get them from me and instead kept on talking about how they'd taste so much better with someone else. Getting nervous, I made some sort of comment about me being underage because, with the way he was looking at me, I was pretty sure that he was referencing me. Then, he leaned across the register, ran his tongue across his nasty teeth and said, "Well, honey, that don't matter unless someone tells." For a second I stood there in shock, then set his stuff down on the belt, turned out my light, and walked away to find a manager. I was lucky to have the mama bear one on shift that night, so I knew that she'd take my side when she found out what happened. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about all the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, the popcorn bucket came that way.